The doctor said my 10-year-old daughter might have 72 hours left. Not 72 hours to recover. 72 hours before her failing liver took away the chance for anyone to save her. Dr. Naomi Kessler stood beside June's bed, with both hands wrapped around a tablet. She spoke carefully, but there was no soft way to say it. A compatible living donor could change the outcome. Without one, the transplant list might not move fast enough. My parents and my younger sister had already been tested. For one foolish second, I believed that meant June was safe. My father closed the hospital room door and placed a thick folder on the table between us. He did not ask how June was feeling. He did not look through the glass at the child who had called him Grandpa since she could speak. "Transfer everything to us," Preston said. I stared at him. "What?" "Your investment accounts. The lake house. The company shares Adrian left you. Everything." My mother folded her arms. "The lake house will be mine. Your father and I have used it for years, and I am not arguing about that." Mallory looked at the keys beside my phone. "I'm taking your car." Behind them, June shifted beneath a white blanket. Her skin had turned the pale yellow of old paper. A monitor gave a sharp beep, then another. My mother lowered her voice as though that made her words less cruel. "You can replace property, Mara. You cannot replace your daughter." That was the moment I understood they expected me to beg. They expected me to fall to my knees, sign whatever they pushed in front of me, and thank them for leaving me with the clothes on my back. Instead, I looked at each of them and said one word. "Understood." My father's shoulders relaxed. Mallory reached for the folder. My mother smiled. They thought I had surrendered. I walked into the hallway and called Lena Ortiz, the woman who watched the lake house when I was away. "Change every access code," I told her. "Do not let anyone into the cottage or the boathouse. Not my parents. Not Mallory. No one." Then I opened the security app Adrian had installed in my car years earlier and preserved every video, route log, emergency call record, and cloud file from the previous 2 weeks. Finally, I sent the recording of the conversation inside June's room to my attorney and to Ian Mercer, Mallory's independent living donor advocate. Less than an hour later, my father called 11 times. My mother called 7. Mallory sent one message. "What did you do?" When I finally answered, my father was shouting. My mother was crying behind him. Mallory kept saying she had changed her mind and would help June. "We're family," my mother pleaded. "We'll save her. Just stop this before you ruin all of us." I asked what exactly I was supposed to stop. There was a brief silence. Then Celeste said, "There is nothing in that boathouse you need to see." I had never mentioned the boathouse. And in that instant, the worst possibility was no longer that my family wanted everything I owned. It was that they knew why my daughter was dying. Stay with me to see what I discovered, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happened when my family realized I was no longer willing to obey them. Dr. Kessler returned before I could decide whether to call my mother back. She closed the door behind her and repeated what she had told me that morning, this time without my family filling the room with their breathing and their demands. 72 hours is an estimate, she said. It is not a clock that reaches zero at an exact minute. June's liver function is deteriorating quickly. We are supporting her while we wait for a donor, but the window can narrow without warning. I nodded, because I was afraid that if I tried to speak, the sound coming out of me would not be human. Mallory had told us the previous afternoon that she was the best match. She had stood near the vending machines and said it herself, almost casually, as though she were reporting the weather. Until that morning, I had believed the remaining evaluations were routine steps between June and the operating room. Ian Mercer called while Dr. Kessler was still with me. I put him on speaker. "The conversation you sent raises a serious concern about coercion," he said. "No property, payment, promise, or family pressure can be tied to a living donation. I will meet with Mallory privately. Your parents will not be present." Can she still donate? I cannot discuss her private medical information without her permission. I can tell you that the process stops unless I am satisfied the decision is informed and voluntary. It was not the reassurance I wanted, but it was the honest answer that mattered more than comfort. When I returned to June's bedside, her eyes were half open. She watched me adjust the blanket, then glanced at the monitor beside her. "Mr. Snitch told on me again," she whispered. "What did you do?" I thought about the needle. The monitor beeped faster. "See?" she said. "No privacy." A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. It was small and broken, but June smiled as though she had accomplished something important. Then she asked, "Did you eat?" I told her I had. Her eyebrows moved just enough to show she did not believe me. I kissed her forehead and walked into the bathroom. The moment the door locked, I bent over the sink and retched until my ribs hurt. Nothing came up. I had not eaten since the night before. I pressed a wet paper towel to my face, counted to 10, and returned to my daughter before she could wonder why I had been gone so long. My phone rang again. Celeste. This time I answered without leaving the room. "Mara, listen to me," she said. "Your father is upset. We all said things under pressure. You brought prepared documents into a hospital. We were trying to make certain everyone was protected." "From what?" She began crying. My mother could summon tears with the efficiency of someone opening an umbrella. "Do not let strangers tear apart the lake house," she said. "There is nothing dangerous in the boathouse. Your father stored a few old supplies there. That is all." I looked at June. "What supplies?" Celeste stopped crying. "I do not know. Boat things. You just said they were not dangerous. I am not doing this with you while you are hysterical." She ended the call. June had been listening with her eyes closed. After a moment, she said, "The water there tasted funny." I moved closer. "At the lake house?" She nodded weakly. "Funny how?" "Like pennies." Grandpa said the pipes were old. She swallowed and winced. "There was a bad smell near the little building too. Sweet, but it made my head hurt." Every instinct in me split in two. One part wanted to drive to the lake, break open the boathouse, and drag the truth out with my own hands. The other part understood that June did not need a detective for a mother. She needed a mother who gave her doctors every fact before chasing anyone else. I pressed the call button and asked the nurse to bring Dr. Kessler back immediately. I told her everything. The strange taste in the water, the sweet chemical smell, the old supplies in the boathouse, Preston's former work restoring boats, Celeste's panic when I locked the property. Dr. Kessler did not waste time asking whether I was certain. She called the hospital toxicologist, ordered expanded testing for industrial solvents, and asked the nurse to contact poison control. She also documented the possible exposure so the hospital could make the required report. "What kind of chemicals did your father use in his old work?" she asked. "Paint removers, degreasers, solvents. I do not know the names. Find out if you can, but do not enter that building yourself. Let the appropriate team collect the samples." I agreed. For the first time that day, my parents were no longer the most urgent problem in the room. The most urgent problem was invisible, already inside June's body, and possibly sitting in containers less than an hour from the hospital. Dr. Kessler looked at me and said, "We do not just need to find someone to save June's liver. We need to find what destroyed it." 9 days earlier, I had driven June to the lake house, believing I was leaving her in the safest place available. I had been hired to supervise the restoration of a historic theater in Albany, and the final inspection required 2 days on site. I considered taking June with me, but she hated sleeping in hotels and had been excited about fishing with her grandfather. My parents offered to keep her from Friday afternoon until Sunday evening. The lake house was not a family inheritance, no matter how often Celeste spoke about it as though it belonged to everyone with our last name. Adrian and I had bought it 13 years earlier, when June was still a baby. The roof leaked, the kitchen floor tilted toward the back door, and mice had claimed the pantry. Adrian repaired the windows while I stripped wallpaper from every room. We chose the paint together, rebuilt the porch, and saved for 3 years before replacing the dock. After Adrian died, I could not bear to sell it. I allowed my parents to use it when I was not there because Preston liked the water, and Celeste enjoyed telling her friends she was spending the summer at the lake. They had keys and access codes, but the deed, insurance, taxes, and every repair bill remained in my name. Permission had slowly become entitlement, and I had been too tired to correct them. June lay quietly while I asked her to tell me everything she remembered about that weekend. Dr. Kessler had warned me not to push her if she became confused or exhausted, so I kept my voice calm and let her stop whenever she needed. Grandpa was working in the little building by the dock, she said. The boathouse? She nodded. There were 3 big metal barrels. They looked old. One had a label, but most of the words were rubbed off. What color was the label? White, maybe yellow around the edges. She closed her eyes, searching for the memory. It smelled sweet, but not good sweet. It burned my nose. Preston had spent most of his career maintaining and restoring boats. Even after retirement, he bought old engines, corroded fittings, and damaged hardware from estate sales, then cleaned and resold them. When June asked what he was doing, he told her he was removing paint and grease from parts of an antique boat. Her water bottle had emptied while she watched him work. Instead of walking back to the house, she drank from the side faucet attached to the boathouse wall. She remembered the water tasting metallic. Within an hour, her head began to ache. Soon she felt dizzy, and then she vomited beside the dock. Did Grandpa call me? June shook her head. He said you were busy. Did he offer to take you to a doctor? He said I probably ate too much at lunch. Mallory had arrived later that afternoon. June remembered hearing her and Preston arguing near the kitchen. She could not recall every word, but she remembered Preston saying a hospital would ask too many questions. He told Mallory to drive her home before Mara's trip ended. Hearing my name spoken in the third person made something cold settle inside me. My father had not been protecting me from worry. He had been making decisions about my sick child while deliberately keeping me outside them. Celeste changed every piece of June's clothing before Mallory left. When June asked why, my mother said she had splashed lake water on herself and would be more comfortable in clean clothes. The shirt, shorts, and socks were placed in a plastic bag. The sneakers June had worn that weekend never came home. I liked those shoes, June murmured. The purple ones. I remember. Grandma said the mud ruined them. There had been no mud on the rest of June's belongings. The plastic bag Celeste mentioned was not in the overnight case either. I had not questioned it because I was grateful they had changed her, washed what they could, and sent her home. Now the missing clothes and shoes no longer felt like housekeeping. They felt like the first things my mother had removed from a scene she did not want me to examine. Gratitude can make ordinary details look harmless. Mallory delivered June to my front door on Sunday evening. She said June had thrown up after eating chicken salad from a roadside cafe. Celeste called 5 minutes later and repeated the same explanation almost word for word. June was tired but alert, and when I asked whether she needed the emergency room, she said she wanted her own bed. I believed them. For the next 2 days, I treated what I thought was food poisoning. I gave June fluids, checked her temperature, and slept on the floor beside her bed. On the second morning, she woke with yellow around the whites of her eyes. Her nose began bleeding while she brushed her teeth. When she stared at me without seeming to understand what I was saying, I carried her to the car and drove to the hospital. Dr. Kessler returned with the toxicologist shortly after June finished telling me about the barrels. They had expanded the testing, but some results could take days. The hospital would not wait for a complete chemical identification before treating acute liver failure. We are supporting her circulation, managing the toxins her liver can no longer clear, and protecting her brain and kidneys, Dr. Kessler explained. At the same time, we continue the transplant process. The investigation cannot delay her care. June glanced at the monitor when it beeped. Mr. Snitch is doing it again. I looked at the screen. He spreads news faster than our relatives. A weak smile crossed her face. Dr. Kessler almost smiled too. Then the door opened, and a woman in a dark blue jacket introduced herself as Detective Evelyn Ward. The hospital had reported a possible hazardous exposure involving a child. Detective Ward did not accuse anyone. She asked who owned the property, who had access, and whether I would consent to investigators collecting water, soil, and surface samples. "The house is mine," I said. "So is the boathouse." She placed a form on the table. I signed it without calling Preston. Lena already had orders to keep everyone out, and Detective Ward said the collection team would coordinate with her. She warned me not to enter the building myself or remove anything from it. After she left, Ian Mercer met me in a consultation room. He explained that Mallory's potential donation could not be tied to money, property, forgiveness, or pressure from any member of the family. He would interview her privately, review whether she understood the physical risks, and make sure she could withdraw without punishment from anyone. He could stop the process if he believed she was being coerced or bargaining for compensation. "Can you tell me when she learned she was compatible?" I asked. "No," he said. "Her medical information belongs to her." I hated the answer, but he was right. Back in June's room, I picked up her old tablet to find a cartoon for her. The device had once been linked to our family group chat, and although June no longer used the account, notification previews still synchronized whenever it connected to the hospital Wi-Fi. A row of old alerts appeared across the screen. Most were grocery lists, photographs, and Celeste reminding everyone about a charity luncheon. Then I saw an image Mallory had posted the previous afternoon. It was a screenshot of an email from the transplant center. Her name was visible at the top. Beneath it, a highlighted sentence confirmed that her preliminary compatibility results allowed her to proceed to the next stage of living donor evaluation. The timestamp was 3:42 p.m. Mallory had received it hours before she entered June's hospital room, pointed at my keys, and announced that she was taking my car. I stared at the time, until the numbers blurred. My sister had not made a cruel demand in a moment of panic. She had walked into that room knowing she might be able to save June, carrying a human life in one hand and a price she had already chosen in the other. The timestamp on Mallory's screenshot was still burning in my mind when I opened the security account connected to my SUV. Adrian had installed the system after a delivery truck clipped us at an intersection, and the other driver claimed we had crossed the red light. The camera recorded the road, the cabin during emergencies, and the rear of the vehicle. GPS logs, impact alerts, and calls made through the hands-free system were stored in the cloud. Adrian had called it excessive, until the footage proved the truck driver was lying. After he died, I kept paying for the service, because canceling it felt like removing another piece of him from our lives. Until that afternoon, I had barely opened the app. I searched the dates surrounding June's weekend at the lake house. The route history showed Mallory leaving the property shortly after 5 on Sunday afternoon. She passed the road leading to the nearest emergency room without turning. June had already vomited several times by then, yet the car continued south. The vehicle stopped for 11 minutes outside a hardware and marine supply store. After that, Mallory drove directly to my house. I clicked the trip record. Video loaded in short sections. Most of the cabin camera showed only the back of Mallory's head, and part of June curled against the passenger door. My daughter looked smaller than I remembered. Her face was pale, and both hands were pressed against her stomach. She leaned forward once and said something I could not hear. Mallory turned up the radio. I lowered the volume on the recording and watched the route again. Mallory had not been rushing June home. She had been calm enough to stop at a store while my daughter sat beside her in pain. Another tab listed calls made through the vehicle. One entry was marked as an emergency voice request. It had occurred the day before Mallory brought June home. The call had been placed to me. I checked my phone and found the voicemail buried beneath messages from the theater restoration team. That afternoon I had been inside a meeting with the city inspector. My phone had been silenced, and I had returned only the calls that appeared urgent. The message from the car had been labeled as an automated service notification. I pressed play. At first, I heard only June breathing. Then her voice came through, frightened and thin. "Call Mom." The system responded that the call had been forwarded to voicemail. "Mom, my stomach really hurts. I threw up again." She paused, and I heard a vehicle door close somewhere nearby. The smell in Grandpa's little building made it hard to breathe. "I want to come home." Mallory's voice moved closer. "June, give me the phone." I called Mom. "She's working. You're going to scare her over a stomach bug." "It doesn't feel like a stomach bug." The message ended after Mallory canceled the call. I covered my mouth and stared at the screen. June had tried to reach me. I had spent that afternoon arguing over whether the theater lobby needed historically accurate light fixtures while my daughter left a message saying she could not breathe. The guilt came quickly, but I did not let it take control. I could hate myself later. June needed me to understand what had happened now. The next saved file began several minutes after the voicemail. Mallory was driving. June remained curled in the passenger seat. Mallory made a hands-free call to Preston. "She's still vomiting," she said. "What exactly was in those containers?" My father did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "Did she touch any of them?" "I don't know." "Did she drink from the faucet by the boathouse?" Mallory glanced at June. "She said she filled her bottle there." Preston muttered something I could not make out. "What?" Mallory asked. "The containers were supposed to be sealed." The words changed the air in the hospital room. Until then, I had been listening to a terrible family conversation. Now I was listening to information that might help keep June alive. I stopped the recording. Dr. Kessler answered on the second call. I told her exactly what I had heard, then sent the voicemail and the unfinished audio file to her secure hospital address. She brought the toxicologist into the call and asked me not to continue listening until they had copied the material. "What kind of work did your father do?" the toxicologist asked. "Boat maintenance and restoration. He stripped paint, cleaned engines, and repaired old metal parts." "Do you know what solvents he used?" "No." "Any degreasers, paint removers, or chlorinated products?" "I remember metal cans in his workshop when I was young, but I never read the labels." Dr. Kessler said they would update poison control with the new exposure history and adjust the testing panel. She also reminded me that they were continuing every supportive treatment available, while June remained eligible for transplant evaluation. Only after the files were safely in the hands of her medical team did I return to the recording. Preston's voice came through again. "Do not take her to the emergency room." Mallory tightened both hands around the steering wheel. "She looks terrible. They will ask where she was and what she touched. Take her back to Mara. Say she ate something bad. What if she gets worse? Then Mara can take her in tomorrow." Celeste spoke in the background. She must have been standing near Preston. "Bring her here first," my mother said. "Her clothes smell like that building. I'll change everything before Mara sees her." "What about the water?" Mallory asked. "We will deal with it before anyone thinks to test it." I paused the file again, but this time there was nothing left to misunderstand. Preston knew the containers might have leaked. Celeste knew June's clothing carried the smell. Mallory knew June was seriously ill and drove past a hospital anyway. I forwarded the complete files to Detective Ward and my attorney. Detective Ward called within minutes and told me investigators were already traveling to the lake house. "Do not contact your parents about what you found," she said. "We need the site preserved before anyone has a chance to alter it. They already tried to get inside." "How do you know?" Lena had sent me 3 alerts while I was listening to the recordings. Preston and Celeste were at the property. They had entered the old code twice, then called her claiming the smart lock was malfunctioning. I called Lena while Detective Ward remained on the line. "They said it was an emergency," Lena told me. "Your father wanted tools from the boathouse." "What did you tell him?" "That the lock is working perfectly. It has simply stopped recognizing people who do not own the house. Despite everything, a brief laugh escaped me. Lena had never needed many words to make her position clear. She assured Detective Ward that both my parents were outside the locked gate and that she would wait for the collection team. I told her not to confront them or enter the boathouse herself. After the call, I looked again at the vehicle dashboard on my screen. Adrian's name was still listed as the primary installer. I remember the afternoon he tested the voice controls by singing the wrong words to every song on the radio. The system had repeatedly asked him to clarify his request while June laughed so hard in the back seat that she hiccuped. He had installed the cameras to protect us from strangers. Years later, the same car had remembered what my family wanted erased. My phone vibrated. Preston had sent another demand for me to meet him. I did not tell him what I had heard. I wrote that I was willing to review his documents in a hospital conference room the following morning. His response arrived less than a minute later. Mallory signs the donation papers after you sign the transfer papers. I read the message twice, then saved copies to 3 separate locations. For the first time, the price they had placed on June's life was no longer hidden inside a hospital conversation. My father had written it down. My father arrived at the hospital the next morning, carrying the same leather folder he had placed beside June's bed. He had changed into a dark suit and polished shoes. Celeste walked beside him with a handbag tucked under one arm, while Mallory followed several steps behind. My sister looked as though she had not slept, but when her eyes met mine, she glanced immediately at the keys in my hand. A nurse directed us to a small conference room, away from the transplant unit. I had requested the room because I would not allow them to discuss June's life within her hearing again. Preston set the folder on the table and pushed it toward me. "Everything is ready," he said. "Once you sign, Mallory can complete her paperwork." I opened the folder slowly. The first document transferred control of my investment accounts. The next assigned the company shares Adrian had left me. Beneath those was a quitclaim deed for the lake house, followed by a vehicle transfer form for my SUV. The final pages contained a broad confidentiality agreement. My parents had not made emotional demands in a moment of panic. They had prepared a complete division of my life. Celeste tapped the deed with one manicured finger. "The house should have been ours years ago. Your father has maintained the dock, and I have taken care of the place whenever you were too busy." "You replaced curtains twice," I said. "I paid for the dock." Her mouth tightened. "This is not the time to keep score." Mallory leaned back in her chair. "A living donor takes a serious risk. You keep acting like I'm asking for a handbag. You asked for my car before you agreed to save a dying child. I need security afterward." Preston folded his hands. "Exactly. A donor deserves to know her future is protected." I turned another page and found the sentence that explained why the folder had been created. By signing, I would release Preston, Celeste, Mallory, and anyone acting on their behalf from all claims connected to known or unknown environmental conditions at the lake house. The language included the cottage, grounds, shoreline, storage structures, and water system. It was not a normal property transfer. It was an attempt to make me surrender the right to ask what had happened there. I kept my expression still. "I need an hour for my attorney to review this." Preston looked toward Mallory. "We do not have time for delays. June is the one without time. That is why you should sign now. If the documents are fair, an attorney will confirm that." For several seconds, my father stared at me, as if trying to decide whether fear had made me obedient or dangerous. Then he nodded. 1 hour. I did not promise to sign. I did not offer them money, property, forgiveness, or protection. I simply carried the folder into an empty family consultation room and scanned every page for my attorney. The answer came quickly. The documents had not been drafted overnight. A creation date printed in the file footer showed that the first version had been prepared 7 days earlier, immediately after June became sick at the lake house. When my attorney requested the native files from the firm named on the cover sheet, the forwarding history showed Preston had contacted the lawyer that same evening. He had claimed I wanted to organize my assets before an extended business trip. The environmental waiver had been added later. Its formatting did not match the rest of the agreement, and one phrase referred to an operator rather than a homeowner. My attorney searched the wording and traced it to an old liability contract from the boat maintenance facility where Preston had once worked. The lawyer had not invented the clause. My father had copied it from an agreement designed to protect a commercial workshop from contamination claims and demanded that it be inserted into the papers, transferring my family home. He had begun preparing to protect himself before anyone told me June's liver was failing. I sent the entire packet to Ian Mercer. He called me from another part of the hospital. "This arrangement cannot be connected to Mallory's donation," he said. "Not the car, the house, the accounts, or any promise made under pressure. My father calls them security for the donor." Ian's voice remained dry. "A thank you gift in living donation does not include a lake house, an SUV, or the signature of a mother whose child is being measured in hours." Despite myself, I almost smiled. "What happens now?" "I will speak with Mallory alone. Your parents will not attend. She will have no contact with them during the evaluation, and there will be no further discussion of property." "Will she still be allowed to donate?" "I cannot share her private medical information. I can only tell you the process will not continue unless I believe the decision is hers." Ian ended the call. A hospital security officer soon escorted Preston and Celeste away from the donor evaluation area. Mallory was taken through another door without them. My father protested that he was her parent. Ian replied that Mallory was 35 years old and did not require parental supervision to make a medical decision. While Ian began the independent evaluation, Detective Ward called from the lake house. I confirmed again that I owned the property and authorized the environmental team to collect samples from the well, pipes, boathouse, soil, and drainage area. "Lena must stay outside the structure," Ward said. "No one enters except the collection team." I called Lena and repeated the instruction. She agreed without argument. Less than 20 minutes later, my mother began calling. I ignored the first 3 attempts. On the 4th, I answered. "Who gave them permission to open the boathouse?" Celeste demanded. She did not ask whether June had survived the night. She did not ask whether Mallory had been approved. Her first concern was the door of a building she had insisted contained nothing important. "I own the property. Your father has equipment in there. Then the investigators can identify it. You are treating us like criminals." "I am treating the building like a possible source of exposure." Preston took the phone from her. "Stop the search. We will help June, but you need to stop making accusations before you understand the consequences. I understand that you prepared an environmental release 7 days ago." Silence replaced his anger. I continued before he could recover. "You contacted a lawyer after June became sick. You copied language from your old workplace contract. Why? You are confused and desperate. Then explain it." He ended the call. Detective Ward sent me updates without making conclusions. The concrete floor inside the boathouse appeared to have been washed recently. Several old metal drums remained against the rear wall, but their labels had been scraped away. The water filter serving the side faucet was new, although my maintenance record showed no approved replacement. A temporary hose and plastic pipe had been fitted to a drain near the work area. Fresh clamps held the pieces together. The arrangement was too crude to be permanent and too deliberate to be accidental. My father called again. I let it ring. Celeste left a voicemail saying we could still handle this privately. Another message followed, warning that humiliating the family would not help June. Neither of my parents mentioned the possibility that their granddaughter had been poisoned. I returned to the conference room, where the unsigned papers remained, spread across the table. Preston had demanded my accounts, my company shares, my car, and the house. Celeste had chosen the lake property. Mallory had chosen the vehicle that carried June home. At first, I had believed they were dividing everything, because they knew I would sacrifice it for my daughter. Now I understood that ownership was not the only thing they wanted. If I signed the deed and environmental release, they could control access to the lake house. If Mallory took the SUV, she could control the vehicle that had preserved the calls and route history. If Preston controlled my accounts and shares, he could bury me under legal threats until June's illness was blamed on something no one could prove. The folder had not been prepared to distribute property after a tragedy. It had been prepared to seize the places where the truth was stored before doctors could identify what had destroyed June's liver. Detective Ward called once more. Her voice had changed. One of the technicians traced the temporary pipe, she said. It was not installed, only to carry rinse water out of the boathouse. I gripped the edge of the table. Where did it go? It was positioned to discharge near the supply line feeding the outside faucet. The same faucet June had used to fill her bottle. Detective Ward's words stayed in my ear after the call ended. The temporary pipe had been positioned to discharge near the same outside faucet June had used to fill her bottle. I looked through the conference room window toward the transplant wing. Somewhere behind those doors, Ian Mercer was deciding whether my sister's offer to donate part of her liver was a voluntary medical decision or the final piece of an extortion plan. I could not enter the evaluation. Neither could Preston or Celeste. Ian had made that boundary clear, and hospital security remained outside the donor area to enforce it. For nearly 2 hours, I sat beside June while nurses checked her blood pressure, drew more blood, and adjusted the medication running into her arm. Her nose began bleeding again. A nurse held gauze beneath it, while another reviewed her clotting results. June watched their faces and asked, "Am I getting worse?" Dr. Kessler did not lie to her. "Your liver is having more trouble doing its job, so we are helping your body while we prepare the next step." June looked at me. I held her hand and told her I was staying exactly where she could see me. Ian found me outside the room shortly after noon. He could not repeat everything Mallory had said during a confidential donor evaluation, but he explained what had happened procedurally. He had met her alone and reviewed the risks of living liver donation. Mallory could suffer bleeding, infection, bile leakage, blood clots, organ complications, or death. Recovery would take weeks, and she had the right to stop the process at any point without explaining her decision to our family. He had also told her that no property, payment, promise of forgiveness, or protection from legal consequences could be attached to the donation. "Did she admit asking for the car?" I asked. "Yes. She also stated that your parents pressured her to treat the donation as leverage." The sentence did not surprise me, but hearing it confirmed still hurt. Mallory had not been dragged unwillingly into the conference room. She had chosen a price and pointed directly at it. Ian continued, "I temporarily paused her approval. She has now met separately with a psychologist and independent legal counsel. Those consultations are not punishments. They exist to make sure she understands what she is choosing." "And what is she choosing?" "She says she wants to proceed, even if she receives no vehicle, no property, no forgiveness from you, and no protection from the investigation." I looked through the glass at June. "Do you believe her?" "My belief is only one part of the review. The transplant committee will make the final decision after considering her medical condition, psychological evaluation, and informed consent." Before he left, Ian told me Mallory had requested a meeting with me. I refused to meet her alone. My attorney joined by secure video. Mallory's independent attorney sat beside her, and Detective Ward arrived to take a formal statement. No one promised Mallory immunity or suggested that donating would erase what she had done. Mallory entered wearing hospital scrubs from her donor testing. Without makeup and without our parents beside her, she looked younger than 35. She sat across from me and twisted a tissue between her fingers until it tore. Detective Ward began by reminding her that the statement was voluntary and that she could consult her lawyer before answering any question. Mallory nodded. "I need Mara to know everything before the surgery." "If there is a surgery," I said. She flinched, but did not argue. Mallory admitted that she had gone into the boathouse on Saturday afternoon after hearing June vomit outside. One of the old metal drums had a wet streak running down its side. A shallow pool had formed beneath it, and the concrete nearby looked darker than the rest of the floor. "Did you know what was inside?" Detective Ward asked. "Not exactly. Dad called it an old cleaning solvent. He said it had been used to strip paint and remove grease from boat parts." "Did you see a label?" Mallory described a faded white label with a red border and several missing letters. She remembered only part of the product name and the name of a marine supplier printed near the bottom. Detective Ward wrote both fragments down. Mallory had then heard Preston asking June whether she had touched the drum or drunk from the faucet beside the building. June said she had filled her bottle there. "What did you do?" I asked. Mallory stared at the table. "I told Dad we should take her to the emergency room, but you didn't. He said the hospital would report the chemicals and inspect the property. He said June probably had a stomach virus, and that taking her in would create a disaster over nothing. So you drove past the hospital?" "Yes." She admitted stopping at the marine supply store because Preston had told her to buy absorbent pads, heavy gloves, and a replacement hose fitting. June remained in the car, vomiting into a bag. My attorney asked, "Why did you agree?" Mallory's answer came quietly. "Because Dad said he had handled problems like that his whole life, and because doing what he said was easier than admitting something terrible might have happened." It was not an excuse, and her attorney did not allow her to present it as one. Mallory confirmed that Celeste changed June's clothes after noticing the chemical smell. "My mother placed the clothes in a contractor bag and threw away the purple sneakers because liquid had soaked into the soles." "Where are they?" Detective Ward asked. "Mom put the bag in the back of Dad's truck. I don't know where he took it." Mallory then described seeing Preston return to the lake house late that night. He had told Celeste he needed to flush the side faucet and wash the boathouse floor before the smell spread. Mallory did not go with him, but she saw his truck leave shortly before midnight and return near dawn. Detective Ward made no promise about how the information would affect the investigation. "Donating part of your liver does not cancel responsibility," she told Mallory. "It does not prevent charges, and it does not buy favorable treatment." "I understand. The police will not interfere with urgent medical care while you are hospitalized, unless you present a danger, attempt to flee, or try to destroy evidence. That is not immunity." "I understand that too." The names, locations, and times Mallory provided were immediately forwarded to Dr. Kessler and the toxicology team. They already knew about the possible solvent exposure from the vehicle recordings, but Mallory's statement gave them a partial product name, the position of the leaking drum, and a narrower timeline. When the meeting ended, Mallory remained seated. "Mara," she said, "I know you hate me." I did not answer. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am not asking for the car. I just want to help June." "You wanted the car yesterday." "I did." "You heard her vomiting and drove past a hospital." Her eyes filled, but I felt no need to comfort her. "I did." A nurse entered before either of us could say more. June had become disoriented and was trying to pull the oxygen sensor from her finger. Blood continued seeping from the place where a line had been removed, despite pressure. Dr. Kessler met me beside her bed. "Her clotting function is worsening. We are controlling what we can, but the margin is getting smaller." An emergency transplant committee convened that afternoon. The surgeon, Ian the psychologist, hospital counsel, and June's care team reviewed Mallory's tests and the circumstances around her decision. I was not inside the meeting. Dr. Kessler later explained that Mallory had already completed most of the medical evaluation before my parents made their demands. Her physical results remained acceptable. The psychological review was stricter because of the coercion and her earlier behavior, but wrongdoing did not automatically make her incapable of giving informed, voluntary consent. Mallory signed new consent documents. They contained no transfer of property, no promise of money, and no agreement protecting her from the investigation. When I saw her again, I wanted to embrace the person who might save my child. At the same time, I wanted to push away the woman who had listened to June beg for me and chosen obedience over an emergency room. I did neither. Save her, I said. The rest comes afterward. Just after sunset, Dr. Kessler entered June's room with the transplant surgeon. Mallory has received final approval, she told me. If both patients' numbers remain acceptable overnight, the surgeries will begin at dawn. The transplant team began preparing June shortly after midnight. Nurses moved around her bed with the controlled speed of people who understood that panic wasted time. They checked her identification band, repeated blood tests, adjusted medications, and explained each step even when her eyes drifted closed before they finished. I sat beside her with a comb and worked through the knots in her hair. June had always hated anyone touching it when she was tired, but that night she stayed still. I wiped the cracks at the corners of her lips with a damp cloth and applied the strawberry balm she kept in her backpack. Her small notebook lay beneath the blanket. It was the list of things she wanted to do after leaving the hospital, written before any of us knew whether leaving was possible. I opened it and read aloud. Eat pancakes at midnight. Swim without Grandpa telling me the water is too cold. Get a dog even though Mom says we travel too much. June opened one eye. You added the last part. You were thinking it. I was thinking 2 dogs. I smiled and turned the page. Several lines had been crossed out. One of them was the plan to fish with Preston at the lake house. I did not ask when she had erased it. After a quiet moment, what of her liver? Does that make her a good person? Does that make her a good person? The question was too large for a 10-year-old, but lying would only leave her alone with it. You can be grateful for one good thing someone does without pretending the bad things never happened, I said. Mallory can make the right choice now, and she can still be responsible for the choices that hurt you. So I don't have to forgive her right away? You never have to forgive someone on a schedule. June studied my face. Are you going to forgive her? I don't know yet. Tonight, I only need her to keep her promise. She looked toward the window, where the glass reflected both of us against the dark hospital room. Are we going to lose our house because of me? I put down the comb. None of this is because of you. They wanted the lake house and the car so she would help. They are not taking either one. They are not taking our home, our car, or your future. What if they say you agreed? I did not sign anything. Your grandfather wrote down what he was trying to do, and a lot of people have seen it now. June's hand tightened around mine. I don't care about the lake house. I know. I care about our real house. That is safe too. She relaxed slightly. And the pancakes? Those are legally protected. Her mouth lifted, though she was too exhausted to laugh. Dr. Kessler entered with the toxicologist before 1 a.m. The expanded tests were not complete, but June's liver injury and the exposure history were consistent with a halogenated industrial solvent. They continued supportive treatment to control the damage her failing liver was causing throughout her body, but none of it removed the need for transplantation. The transplant remains the best chance to save her, Dr. Kessler said. Identifying the chemical helps us anticipate complications and guide her care. It does not reverse the injury that has already occurred. Detective Ward called soon afterward with a preliminary environmental update. The collection team had detected carbon tetrachloride in residue from one of the old drums and in water sampled near the outside faucet. The concentrations and final chain of custody analysis still required confirmation, so she would not call it a legal conclusion yet. Medically, however, the information was sent immediately to the toxicology team. Carbon tetrachloride had once been used in cleaning and degreasing products. Preston would have known what it was. He would also have known it did not belong beside a water source used by a child. Ward had obtained the smart lock and utility records with my consent. The logs showed Preston entering the lake house shortly before 2 a.m. after June became ill. The water pump ran continuously for several hours, far longer than any normal household use. During the same period, system alerts were manually cleared from the property account. My father had not spent that night wondering whether his granddaughter was safe. He had spent it running water through the place where she had been exposed. I ended the call, before anger could pull me away from June. There would be time to deal with Preston. There might not be another quiet hour with my daughter before surgery. My phone lit up with a message from Celeste. "Stop this investigation. Mallory is already under terrible stress. If you keep pushing, she may decide she cannot go through with the donation." The threat was carefully phrased, but its meaning had not changed. My mother was still trying to place June's life on one side of a scale and her own protection on the other. I forwarded the message to Ian without replying. He called minutes later and told me Preston and Celeste had been blocked from contacting Mallory directly until the surgical team completed the process. Hospital staff would monitor visitors, and any communication involving pressure, property, or the investigation would be documented. "Do not answer with a threat of your own," he warned. "Mallory's decision must remain voluntary. I am not going to threaten her." "I know. I am telling you because everyone involved needs clean boundaries now." Clean boundaries sounded simple, until the person behind them could save your child. I wanted to demand that Mallory continue. I wanted to remind her of June vomiting beside her while she drove past the hospital. Instead, I let Ian and the transplant team protect the choice from both my parents and me. The surgeon met with me before dawn. He explained the risks to June, including bleeding, infection, blood clots, primary graft failure, rejection, and complications affect. Even a successful operation would not mean an immediate recovery. She would go to intensive care, remain sedated at first, and require lifelong monitoring. I asked how much of Mallory's liver would be removed, how her pain would be managed, what signs of trouble the team would watch for, and who would care for her after discharge. I did not ask those questions because I had forgiven her. I asked because gratitude did not require me to lie about the past, and anger did not permit me to stop caring whether another human being survived. I signed the surgical consent forms. A nurse brought a warming blanket and tucked it around June. Her fear became more visible as the anesthesiology team entered. The monitor accelerated. "Mr. Snitch is telling everyone I'm scared," she whispered. That machine clearly learned nothing about keeping secrets from our family. June gave me a tired smile. Maybe it should testify. At this rate, it probably has a lawyer. A second team passed the doorway, pushing Mallory toward another operating room. I saw her only briefly. She looked pale beneath a blue surgical cap, with Ian walking several feet behind the gurney. Our eyes met, but neither of us spoke. The two sisters were taken in opposite directions. One was giving part of herself to repair damage she had helped conceal. The other was fighting to live without understanding why the adults around her had made survival so complicated. I realized then that gratitude and justice would have to exist together. I could thank Mallory for what she was about to do without allowing it to erase what she had already done. Saving June came first, but first did not mean only. The surgical doors opened. A nurse asked me to step back. June reached from beneath the blanket and caught my fingers before they wheeled her away. "Don't let them take our house," she said. I bent close enough for her to see that I meant every word. "They lost it the moment they chose it, instead of choosing you." The operating room doors closed at 5:41 inches the morning. A nurse led me to a surgical waiting area, where a television played the weather with the sound turned off. Snow was expected in the higher elevations. Traffic was moving normally. Somewhere outside the hospital, people were choosing breakfast and complaining about work while surgeons prepared to remove part of my sister's liver and place it inside my daughter. I knew only what the medical team chose to tell me. I could not see either operating room, and I refused to imagine that I understood what was happening behind those doors. Every update came through a nurse or physician who stepped into the waiting area, confirmed my name, and spoke in careful sentences. The first update came shortly after 7. Mallory's surgery had begun as planned. June was under anesthesia, but her blood clotting problems required additional preparation before the transplant team could proceed. Lena arrived carrying 2 paper cups and a small canvas bag. She did not tell me everything would be fine. She did not say June was strong or that God had a plan. She sat beside me, placed one cup within reach, and stayed quiet. I was grateful for that. At 8:30, a surgeon in blue scrubs entered the waiting room. My body rose before my mind understood why. I thought he was coming to tell me someone had died. He was looking for another family. I sat down so quickly that coffee spilled across my hand. Lena wiped it away with a napkin. This machine coffee is cold enough to qualify as a medical treatment. She tasted her own cup, made a face, and added, "The toxicology team should probably collect this as a sample." A laugh broke out of me. It lasted only a few seconds before turning into tears. Lena moved the coffee aside and rested her hand on the chair between us. She still did not tell me to stop crying. At 9:12, one of Mallory's surgeons came to see me. The portion of liver had been removed safely. Mallory was stable and being transferred to recovery, where the team would monitor her for bleeding and other complications. Relief passed through me so sharply that I felt ashamed of it. Mallory had helped conceal what happened to June, but I still did not want her to die on an operating table. Wanting justice had not turned me into someone who wished for another body to be destroyed. The surgeon warned that June's operation would continue for hours. Her clotting remained difficult to control, and her blood pressure had become unstable during the early stage of surgery. The team was giving blood products, medication, and continuous support. "What does that mean for her chances?" I asked. "It means the operation is more complicated than we hoped. They are still working." He did not offer false reassurance. I respected him for it, and hated him for it at the same time. Every door that opened made me stand. A respiratory therapist crossed the hall, and I thought she was coming for me. A hospital chaplain entered carrying a notebook, and my knees weakened until he walked toward an older couple near the window. Twice, nurses called names that sounded enough like mine to stop my breathing. Detective Ward called shortly before noon. I nearly ignored the phone because I was afraid any distraction would be punished by bad news from the operating room. Then I remembered that the investigation might still help June's doctors understand what they were treating. The scene team had found the 3 old drums. One showed signs of leakage near its lower seam. Absorbent pads and stained cloths had been packed into heavy disposal bags behind a false panel in the boathouse. The labels had been scraped away, but fragments remained beneath the adhesive. They also recovered the newly installed water filter and sections of the temporary piping. Tool marks and fresh sealant suggested the system had been altered after June became ill. "That proves they cleaned something," I said. "It supports that conclusion," Ward replied. "We are still documenting who did what and when." She had more. Investigators obtained emails between Preston and the marine supplier that had sold him the solvent years earlier. The company had sent a safety warning when regulations changed, instructing customers not to store carbon tetrachloride near drains, wells, or drinking water systems. Preston had opened the message and clicked an electronic confirmation, acknowledging that he had read it. He had known the risk before June ever stepped inside that building. Ward then described receipts recovered from the supplier and a hardware store. On the morning after June became sick, someone purchased a portable pump, industrial gloves, cleaning agents, absorbent material, replacement filters, and heavy disposal bags. The payment card belonged to Celeste. My mother had used the hours after June began vomiting to buy supplies for cleaning the boathouse. My father had used those supplies to wash the floor, replace the filter, and run water through the system. Either one of them could have called me. They could have called an ambulance. They could have told the emergency room what June might have touched. They could have brought the container label to the hospital and given the toxicology team a 9-day head start. Instead, they cleaned. The waiting room tilted. I reached for the chair but missed it. Lena caught my arm and lowered me to the floor before I fell. "I left her there," I said. Lena crouched beside me. "You left her with her grandparents." "I should have known. You trusted people who wanted to be trusted." She called me from the car. "You were working." Mallory was beside her. Preston knew the chemical. Celeste saw the clothes. 4 adults had the chance to act before you knew there was danger. I pressed both palms against my face. Understanding who was responsible did not remove the guilt. It only stopped the guilt from becoming the entire truth. At 2 in the afternoon, Dr. Kessler came into the waiting area. I stood but could not make myself ask the question. "The new liver segment is in place," she said. "The surgeons have established blood flow, but June has required significant support. Her clotting and blood pressure remain concerns." "Is it working?" "We need time to see how the graft responds." Those words became the shape of the next several hours. We need time. At 4, June was still in surgery. At 5:30, the transplant surgeon told me they had controlled the most dangerous bleeding. Her circulation was more stable, but she remained critically ill. At 7, they transferred her to intensive care. I was allowed to see her after the team settled her into the room. Tubes, lines, monitors, and pumps surrounded the bed. Her face was swollen. A ventilator breathed for her. Nothing about the scene looked like victory. Dr. Kessler showed me the first signs that the transplanted liver had begun functioning. The blood flow studies were encouraging, and several laboratory values were moving in the right direction. Those changes did not promise a smooth recovery. June still faced rejection, infection, bleeding, kidney injury, and the possibility that the toxic exposure had harmed her brain. "She survived the operation," Dr. Kessler said. "Now we watch hour by hour." Mallory remained stable in another unit. I asked whether she was awake. "Briefly," Dr. Kessler said. "She is in pain, but her immediate recovery is progressing as expected." I sat beside June through the evening. Nurses reduced some of the sedation, but she did not wake immediately. Once, her fingers moved against the sheet. Another time, her eyelids fluttered without opening. Near 10, she finally looked at me for several seconds. The breathing tube had been removed, but oxygen still flowed through a mask, and her voice was barely more than air. I leaned close. "Don't forget the pancakes," she whispered. "I won't." Her eyes closed again, before I could say anything else. I did not call it a miracle or a happy ending. A few words did not erase the danger still surrounding her. They only gave me enough hope to remain in the chair until morning. Detective Ward called once more before midnight. I stepped no farther than the doorway so I could still see June. "The leaking drum may have begun as an accident," she said. But from the moment Preston knew June had been exposed, nothing he did afterward was an accident. The days after the transplant did not move forward in a straight line. June improved by inches, then frightened us by slipping backward overnight. Her new liver began working, but every medication created another problem to watch. She took anti-rejection drugs on a strict schedule, and the nurses checked her blood so often that the inside of her arms became a map of fading bruises. On the 3rd day, 2 nurses helped her sit on the edge of the bed. She lasted less than a minute before dizziness forced her back against the pillows. The next morning, she swallowed 3 spoonfuls of broth and slept for 2 hours afterward. I learned to celebrate measurements that would once have seemed meaningless. 5 minutes upright, 1 bite without nausea, a temperature that remained normal through the night. Mallory stayed in the hospital for 6 days. I received updates through Ian and her attorney because neither of us was ready for an unguarded conversation. Her recovery was painful but medically expected. She walked bent forward, needed help getting out of bed, and could manage only short distances along the corridor. When she was discharged, she moved to a furnished apartment near the hospital with a home care nurse checking on her. She was not suddenly healthy because she had done one courageous thing. Her body carried the cost of it every time she stood. While June learned to sit and eat again, my parents began telling their version of what had happened. An aunt I had not spoken to in years sent me a message saying Preston and Celeste were devastated that I had seized the lake house they had cared for throughout their retirement. Another relative asked why I was using June's illness to punish 2 elderly people over a plumbing accident. Celeste told members of her church that I had become unstable from stress and had locked them out of a home they had maintained for years. The story grew cleaner each time it was repeated. The leaking drum became an old pipe. The erased labels disappeared. The hours Preston spent flushing the system became emergency repairs. The hospital room where they divided my property became a misunderstanding caused by fear. Their attorney sent a letter requesting immediate visitation with June. It described my parents as loving grandparents, being unfairly separated from a recovering child. A second letter threatened to hold me responsible as the property owner for failing to maintain a safe water system. My attorney asked whether I wanted to issue a public statement. No, I said. June is not evidence for social media. I did not call relatives to defend myself. I did not post photographs from the ICU or release the recording from the hospital room. Every hour spent arguing with people who had chosen my parents' story was an hour taken from June's recovery or from. Detective Ward continued building the case without telling me every tactical detail. She explained only what I needed to know and what I was legally permitted to see. Mallory, represented by her own attorney, voluntarily surrendered her phone for forensic review. The group chat filled the gaps between the conversations we had already recorded. On the afternoon, the transplant center confirmed Mallory could continue as a donor. Preston wrote, "Do not approach Mara yet. Wait until the doctor gives her a deadline. She signs when she understands there is no time left." Mallory replied, with a photograph of the compatibility email. Celeste sent a list beneath it. Lake house first, then car. Make sure the environmental release is included. The messages from the weekend June became sick were worse. Celeste wrote that the purple shoes needed to disappear because the soles still smelled of solvent. She told Preston to replace the filter before Mara tested the water. In another message, she asked Mallory whether Adrian's vehicle system stored cabin audio and said, "If it does, delete whatever you can before she thinks to look." Mallory had answered that she did not know the password. The forensic team also recovered email metadata connected to the legal packet. The first draft had been created on day -7, 6 full days before Dr. Kessler gave me the 72-hour warning. Preston had contacted the law firm under the false claim that I wanted to transfer assets before a long overseas project. The attorney drafted ordinary transfer documents based on that lie. Several hours later, Preston emailed a separate paragraph copied from an old commercial liability agreement. He instructed the attorney to insert it without explaining that June had become sick after visiting the property. That paragraph became the environmental waiver he later tried to place beneath my hand in the hospital. They had prepared the trap before they knew whether June would survive. Mallory agreed to testify during the upcoming family meeting by video. Her lawyer warned that the statement could expose her to criminal charges and damage her career. She still agreed. "I already chose silence once," she told Detective Ward in a recorded interview. "I know what it cost June." Her decision did not repair what she had done, but it was the first sign that she understood confession was not a performance designed to win me back. Ward and the prosecutor sought additional search warrants and arrest warrants based on the evidence collected from the property, the vehicle data, the medical timeline, the messages, and Mallory's statement. I was not told when the applications would be reviewed, or what the officers planned to do if the warrants were granted. Ward only said, "We need Preston and Celeste to state their position one more time without knowing everything we have." Preston made that easy. On the 12th day after surgery, his attorney requested a formal meeting about visitation and a private family resolution. Preston believed the transplant had removed his leverage over June, but had also removed my reason to keep fighting. His message said further conflict would embarrass everyone and damage Mallory's recovery. He still thought shame was stronger than evidence. June continued improving slowly. By the 14th day, she could sit in a chair beside the window for 20 minutes. She ate half a cup of applesauce and complained that hospital food seemed designed by people who hated flavor. The doctors remained cautious. Her anti-rejection medications left her vulnerable to infection, and every new pain still made my chest tighten. One afternoon, she heard me discussing my parents' letter with my attorney. "Why do grown-ups call a lie their version of the truth?" she asked after I ended the call. Because aversion sounds respectable, I said. It is like putting a beautiful coat over something ugly and hoping no one notices what is underneath. Does the coat work? Only until someone opens it. She considered that, then returned to the puzzle in her lap. On day 16, hospital legal services confirmed the meeting for the next morning. It would concern visitation, property access, and the so-called family settlement. June would remain in her room with Lena and would hear none of it. Mallory would appear remotely from the apartment near the hospital because she was still weak and could not sit upright for long. My attorney arranged the documents in chronological order. Detective Ward said very little. I understood that the meeting was not being held so I could deliver a speech. It was being held because Preston and Celeste still believed they could repeat their story until everyone else became tired enough to accept it. On the 7th of Nai for the transplant, I entered the hospital's legal conference room and took the seat beside my attorney. Preston arrived minutes later, carrying the same leather folder he had brought to June's bedside. Celeste walked beside him, dressed carefully for the role of a wounded grandmother. Their lawyer followed. My father smiled as he sat across from me. He still believed the only person who would be signing papers that day was me. The hospital's legal conference room held more people than Preston expected. My attorney sat beside me. Across the table, Preston and Celeste were joined by their lawyer. A representative from the hospital's legal department attended because my parents were demanding access to June. Detective Ward sat near the door, with an investigator from Child Protective Services. A monitor had been positioned at the end of the table. Mallory appeared on the screen from the apartment near the hospital, leaning against several pillows. Her face was pale, and she held one arm across her abdomen whenever she shifted. Her attorney sat beside her. June was upstairs with Lena. She would not hear any of what happened in that room. Celeste began crying before anyone had formally started. "We have already suffered enough," she said. "Mallory gave part of her liver to save that child, and Mara has repaid us by treating us like criminals." Preston placed the leather folder on the table. "We are asking for a reasonable resolution. Mallory deserves compensation for her sacrifice, and we deserve access to our granddaughter." Their lawyer described the contamination as an unfortunate plumbing accident. He said my parents had spent years maintaining the lake property and that I was now exploiting June's illness to remove them from a home they considered part of the family. I did not answer with a speech. My attorney opened the first file. She placed Mallory's compatibility email on the screen, along with the timestamp showing she had received it before entering June's room and demanding my vehicle. Preston's lawyer said preliminary compatibility did not guarantee that Mallory could donate. "No one claimed it did," my attorney replied. "The point is that she knew she possessed potential leverage before the property demands were made." The second file contained the recording from June's hospital room. My father's voice filled the conference room. "Transfer everything to us." Celeste's voice followed. "The lake house will be mine." Then Mallory said she was taking my car. My attorney played the recording only once. She did not need to repeat it. When it ended, she displayed Preston's later message. "Mallory signs the donation papers after you sign the transfer papers." Celeste stopped crying. Preston folded his arms. Those words were written during an emotional crisis. My attorney moved to the third file. The metadata showed that the transfer documents had been started 6 days before the doctors gave me the 72-hour warning. Preston had contacted the law firm under the false claim that I wanted to arrange my assets before an overseas project. He later sent the environmental release himself, copied from an old commercial liability agreement. The paragraph appeared on the screen. It would have forced me to waive claims involving known or unknown environmental conditions at the lake house, including the water system, storage buildings, and surrounding land. Their lawyer looked toward Preston. His expression changed slightly, as if that detail had not been fully explained to him. The fourth file contained the vehicle evidence. The route map showed Mallory driving past the nearest emergency room. The GPS log showed the stop at the marine supply store. The cabin footage showed June curled against the passenger door. Then my daughter's voice came through the speakers. "Call Mom." I watched Celeste lower her eyes. The voicemail continued. June said her stomach hurt, that she had vomited, and that the smell in the boathouse made it difficult to breathe. Mallory told her she was suffering from a stomach bug and ended the call. The next recording captured Preston asking whether June had touched the drums or drunk from the outside faucet. Mallory told him the containers were supposed to have been sealed. Preston ordered her not to go to the emergency room. Celeste's voice followed, saying June's clothes needed to be changed before I saw them. My mother reached for a glass of water, but her hand shook badly enough that the glass struck the table. The fifth set of evidence was placed before them without commentary. Environmental results showed carbon tetrachloride in residue from the leaking drum and in water collected near the outside faucet. The smart lock records showed Preston entering the lake house before 2 in the morning. The pump logs showed water running for hours. Emails proved he had received and acknowledged a warning not to store the chemical near wells, drains, or drinking water systems. Receipts showed that Celeste's card purchased a pump, gloves, filters, cleaning agents, absorbent pads, and disposal bags the morning after June became sick. Preston leaned forward. The leaking container was an accident. I looked at him for the first time since the meeting began. The leaking container was an accident, I said. Watching a child vomit and choosing to protect yourself was a decision. His face hardened. You have no idea what would have happened if authorities found those chemicals. The property would have been condemned. Everything your mother and I cared for would have been destroyed. June nearly died. And she did not, Celeste said quickly. Mallory saved her. We only asked for the house and car because your sister deserved something after what she was willing to give. Mallory closed her eyes on the monitor. My attorney invited her to speak. Mallory confirmed that Preston had ordered her not to take June to the emergency room. She confirmed that Celeste disposed of the purple shoes and moved the contaminated clothes. She also confirmed that all 3 of them had agreed to wait until the doctors gave me a deadline before demanding that I sign the transfers. Preston stared at the screen. You are destroying your own family. Mallory's voice was weak but clear. We did that before this meeting. Celeste turned back to me. You are twisting everything. We wanted property because Mallory needed protection. I placed my hand on the leather folder. You weren't asking for my property, I said. You were asking me to hand you the evidence. The room became quiet. The house gave them control over the boathouse, water system, and contaminated drums. The car contained the route logs, voicemail, and calls they had tried to erase. The environmental release would have weakened my right to pursue what happened on my own property. My accounts and company shares would have given Preston the resources to control every legal fight that followed. Their demands had never been only about greed. They had been an attempt to own every place where the truth had survived. Detective Ward stood. She explained that a judge had signed arrest warrants before the meeting. The decision was based on evidence already gathered through the investigation, not on anything my parents had said in the last few minutes. 2 officers entered quietly from the hall. There was no shouting from a crowd, and no dramatic rush into the room. Preston asked to see the warrants. His lawyer told him not to say anything else. Celeste began crying again, but this time she did not look at me. She kept repeating that she had only followed her husband's instructions. They were escorted out separately. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt as though something inside me had finally broken beyond repair. The people taken through that door were responsible for what happened to June, but they were also the parents whose approval I had chased for most of my life. I was not grieving who they were. I was grieving the people I had spent years pretending they could become. When the room emptied, I turned toward Mallory's image. I am grateful for what you gave June, I said. She is alive because of it. Mallory nodded, tears running silently down her face. But the surgery did not buy my car. It did not buy forgiveness, and it did not buy your way back into our family. I know, she said. I am not asking for any of those things. Her attorney ended the call after confirming she needed to rest. I returned upstairs. June was awake, arranging puzzle pieces on the tray across her bed. Did they clear out the extra chairs? She asked. Mr. Snitch needs more room for all his opinions. I sat beside her and moved the monitor wire away from the puzzle. She looked at my face and stopped smiling. Are they gone, Mom? Yes, I said. For the first time, that word did not mean we had been abandoned. It meant we were safe.